The middle class, the heart of the American dream, might just be imploding, taking your quality of life down with it and limiting your freedom forever. Because the middle class is the backbone of the economy. When it begins to break, millions of people's lives are affected for the worse, including yours. Only 3% of people will break out and build real wealth. 97% will fall. Why? This is a story about plummeting household wealth, suffocating debt, soaring house prices, and the fruits of your labor being stolen right from underneath you. This is the fall of the middle class, how it happened, and 3 things that you can do to prevent yourself from collapsing with it, while building generational wealth at the same time. So what's happening exactly? This year, US household wealth declined for the 2nd quarter in a row, but this time it didn't just go down. It went down by the largest amount ever on record. And it gets worse. In the first 6 months of 2022, Americans' wealth fell by $6 trillion. Now, this is something that we've gotten used to because just 2 years ago, there was also a big drop in net worth, a drop with a pretty obvious cause. But aside from the global boogeyman, the drop this year is actually $30 billion larger than the pandemic record. So the question is, why were we the ones to break the worst record in the Guinness Book? And what does it mean for the future of the middle class? Much of the answer is tied to larger economic trends: high inflation, interest rate hikes, and a rocky stock market that's pretty solidly in bear territory. But when you move everything aside and zero in on just the middle class, you'll see that certain elements have been working against us for the last 30 years. What are these elements that aren't working? And how are they contributing to the fall of the middle class? Well, incomes have stagnated, which is strange because for the last 40 years, productivity has gone up. It's just not being reflected in wages. And it's not that everyone is making less. No. The middle class's share of all income has fallen by 20% since 1970, meaning the middle class has been producing more and more, but getting less and less in return. Ultimately, the 10%, top 1%, and especially top 0.1% are just benefiting more and more from the growth of the economy than everyone else. But it gets worse, because you'd think the obvious solution to this inequality would be to just get a degree, open you up to lucrative career opportunities. No. These days, even with a college degree, that's not a guarantee of good wage growth. Research in the early 2010s showed that the hourly wages of young college graduates were lower after adjusting for inflation than they were in the late 1990s. I actually have a friend who recently graduated. He got a job in his specific field. That job pays $15 an hour for the first 2 years. But hold on. Because that doesn't have to be you. You don't have to be a victim of the middle class or the economy. I'm gonna crack this open and show you strategies that you can use to prevent this collapse from getting the best of you, ones that will actually help you prosper. But first, we need to talk about something else: prices. The cost of living has shot up faster than Nancy Pelosi's stock portfolio. I'm kidding. That'd probably break the laws of physics or something. Either way, life is expensive, and it might sound like I'm stating the obvious here, but you really don't want it to be too expensive. That's when the entire system collapses. In the last 50 years, housing costs have gone up 190%, college tuition up 260%. More recently, there's been huge increases in the price of stuff that fills you and your car up. Food costs are up almost 11%, and gas prices have hit national highs. I own a trucking business. This is crazy. We spend about $3,000 more on fuel each month this year versus last year. And if you live in an already expensive city, man, you have it way worse. To raise a middle-class family in New York or San Francisco, you need to make $300,000 a year. To put that in perspective, in 2020, only 10% of all households in the US made over $200,000, which means, some calculations, that goal is pretty much impossible for most people. The general picture is the same across the board. Even when incomes have gone up, it hasn't been nearly enough to match much, much greater costs in living.
But what are the new rules in an economy where inflation rises while the price of gas falls and unemployment stays low, but that unemployment doesn't lead to higher wages?
The middle class is playing this losing game, chasing a lifestyle they just cannot afford. But this is where in my research, I found a really surprising piece of data. According to Bloomberg, the poorest Americans are actually in the best financial position in a generation, and it sounds too good to be true, but the average household net worth for the lowest income earners has literally doubled since 2019. And there's two reasons why. The first is stocks. The richest people own far more stocks, which is why those folks have seen their net worth fall by more than 10%, even more if your last name is Zuckerberg. The middle class, they own some stocks, which is why their net worth has fallen a bit as well. But the poorest have the least exposure to the stock market, which in a year like this one is actually kind of a blessing, in a weird way. Then we combine that with factor number 2, wage increases for the poorest Americans. There's some real improvement here. And while things are obviously far from perfect, we're left with this sliver of hope. A sliver of hope that inequality is getting better, starting with the poorest Americans first. And that could just maybe trickle to the middle class as well. But even that will only be possible if the middle class gets a hold of one major issue. Can you guess what it is? Debt. The amount of household debt has absolutely exploded. By the second quarter of 2022, American households owed over $16 trillion in debt. In 2012, that number was only $11 trillion. It's gone up over 40% in just 10 years. The biggest issues here are housing costs, student loans, cars, and medical debt.
Close majority of people paying student loans are only paying interest. So they're not actually chipping away at that principal, and it means that the amount just builds up and builds up over time.
They're just getting by. And spoiler alert, getting by isn't a very good financial plan. You can see how this just combines perfectly with other issues like some kind of financially sadistic jigsaw puzzle. Lower wages relative to increased living costs means more bills on credit cards. As the debt builds up, it becomes harder and harder to pay the entire balance, meaning you get further and further behind. Eventually, you can never catch up.
The consumers that have a whole lot of debt really are struggling to survive.
This is a pretty sad picture that shows you exactly the vicious cycle that causes the middle class to eventually implode. We're in a place now where families are falling out of the middle class through economic forces alone. 40 years ago, the middle class meant a steady income, owning a home, and financial security for you and your family. Families are still getting the same stuff, but often have to take on debt just to afford that stuff, which means that even if you're technically middle class, you own a home and you have a moderately high income, your bills and debt mean you really don't have much in the way of financial security. And the increased cost of living means your lifestyle might become completely unaffordable.
A lot of cases, the real problems are the families who are downwardly mobile, the families who were middle class, who had sort of accumulated debt based on the expectations that they would remain middle class, and then something happens in the economy. You lose your job, but you've still got your mortgage and your car payments and your college loans.
What this means is that a lot of folks who claim to be middle class really aren't. In some ways, middle class has become more of a marker or a way of feeling than some actual financial reality. This is an extremely uncomfortable fact, but if you have punishing debt and tanking finances, it may mean you've actually slipped out of the middle class. So this is bleak. But what can be done to fix it? Because while this is a story of the middle class, you're probably a character in it, going down with the ship. So what can you do? And beyond the negative forces that we just chatted about, we're also in rough waters economically, which compounds the damage on the middle class.
We're in a crisis. The crisis will get worse, and it could get far worse.
And while you can't fix that, there are things that you absolutely can do. Number one, get a clear picture of your current financial situation, like down to the decimal point. This is not fun. It's about as unfun as things get, but it's absolutely necessary. Make a list of your current debts and APR that you're being charged on all of those debts. List your monthly incomes. List your monthly expenses. Create a gosh darn budget. You really cannot improve what you don't measure. You need to measure your finances. I can't stress this enough. Now, luckily, there are free apps out there that can help you with this. I use one called Personal Capital. Again, totally free, tracks all of your finances. I'll link it down below. Now, number 2, pay off any debt you can, especially anything that's high interest. A good strategy here is after you've made your list of debts, order them from highest interest to lowest. You know where to start and begin doing everything you can to pay those debts off. Another strategy is to refinance, especially if you have lots of bad debts, stuff like credit cards or high car payments. Anything above like 7% interest is pretty bad and you should try to get rid of it. And here's a little trick you can do. You can often do balance transfers and get credit cards with low or zero introductory interest rates, which means you can take that crazy high interest rate credit card, transfer it to a new card, and pay off the debt without interest for a period of time. This can be an absolute lifesaver. Here's a good deal I found. I'll have this card linked down below as well. Now, number 3, work on boosting your credit score. A better score means you can borrow money at lower rates, which will impact everything from credit card bills to auto loans. You can improve your score by making sure you pay off your debt on time, not holding any large balances on your credit cards, and correcting any mistakes on your file that might be bogging down your score, and that's usually free to do. And finally, once you have all your debts squared away, it's time to focus on income and investing. Now, this might be a little bit controversial, but I think focusing on more income is more important than investing, at least at first. If you have $1,000 to invest, more often than not, you're better off investing either into yourself to learn a skill or to get an active investment, because it's simply gonna earn you far more than the stock market or some other passive investment would. Here's an example. When I was 18, I bought this used trailer for $500. It was a total piece of junk, but I rented it out for $40 a day on Craigslist. And I actually made around $4,000 in the first year of owning this trailer. And then I just took the trailer and I sold it for $500. So for no money, I made $4,000. This kind of thing is totally possible, and it's really just gonna earn you so much more than most passive investments will. So I believe you should amplify your income first. Then when you have more cash than you have time, begin investing in low-cost index funds that you plan to hold for a long period of time. This is far from easy, but it's exactly how you prevent the middle class from taking you down with it, allowing you to shoot out like a rocket, building generational wealth over time. So if you're feeling fired up, hit the subscribe button and get to work, because this is the end of the video.